In this video, I will share with you a very simple and straightforward setup for your Leica Q343, specifically for photography purposes. I will go through the main settings that will make the biggest difference to you, and the whole idea of this video is to get you going as quickly as possible. Now, this is just how I set up the camera. This is not the correct or the best way. This is simply what works for me, and this is what has stuck with me over the last 4 or 5 months of using this almost exclusively. If you want to know a lot more about my setup, specifically video features, and going really in depth into every single feature, I have just released a Q343 guide, which I'm pretty sure will also carry over to the regular Q3 as well. I've linked that down below. The guide is made by me from scratch. It's not outsourced, and it's one of the main ways I support myself and this channel. So if you want to learn more about your Q3 and support, then that's pretty much the best way to do so. I've linked it down below. Thank you if you even consider it. And let's get into the custom buttons. In my opinion, Leica has the best system for custom button setup and how they work in general. So if you press the button once, it works just like any other camera and triggers a particular function. However, if you press and hold it, then you will get a sub-menu that will allow you to change the functionality of the custom button. The best bit is that you can actually modify how many things come up in that menu. What it means is that you can actually change what the buttons do on the fly without having to go through a ton of different menus, sub-menus, and settings. Let's first set up the actual menus. To do that, go into the menu, then go to page 4, customize control, and here you can select, let's say, function button 2, and you can then turn on and off specific features. So let's first start with function button 1. If I press and hold it, the default is AF mode, and the second option is focus assist. Function button 2, if I press and hold it, the default is focus mode, and the second option is magnification. Thumb wheel button, if I press and hold, the default is AFL and AEL, and the other two options are AEL and AFL on their own. And the last button, which is the center button, if you press and hold it, the default is photo video, but there's a bunch of other critical functions like digital zoom, exposure metering, and white balance. I personally have it on photo video because I use this as a hybrid camera. However, if you're only a photographer, then you might want digital zoom or exposure metering. That's entirely up to you. There are certain scenarios where I know I will not be using the video functionality, therefore I will use exposure metering. Now, there is a little trick to get around it if you do want the central button to do, let's say, exposure metering, but you still want to switch into video quickly. To do that, if you press the menu button once, you'll get into this splash screen with all the main settings, and simply just tap on video and exit the menu, and now you're in video mode without having an assigned custom button for it. Now let's talk about the methodology of why I've set the buttons up in such a way. Let's start with the 2 function buttons, which are both programmed to only deal with focusing tasks. The reason it's so simple is because I want to keep the setup straightforward, and I want to ensure muscle memory. I don't want to have buttons scattered all over the place. So the function buttons in their original configuration will deal with the autofocus. However, the second option will deal with manual focus assists. So FN1, if you press it once, you can change from field to spot to multi-field. However, if you press and hold it, you will get it into focus assist. So if you're shooting manual, you can change it into that. Function 2 will deal with your AFC and AFS, but if you're shooting in manual focus, you don't need that. And if you press and hold it, you can change it into magnification. Therefore, you can quickly toggle magnification on and off to help with manual focusing. Moving on to the thumb wheel dial, this exclusively deals with locking your exposure, focus, or both. I'll typically lock both because it makes sense for how I shoot. For you, it might be different. And the last button is of course the central button. There's no particular theme to it, instead it just has all the functions that I would want to use on a custom button under that one because it's the only one that's left. Now let's talk about the shutter. This is a leaf shutter, which means it only goes up to 1/2000th of a second, which is fine for many scenarios. However, if you're shooting on a very bright sunny day or you want to open that lens up, it's not enough. You also have the electronic shutter, which can help you with increasing that shutter speed. The hybrid option is where the camera will use the mechanical up to its limit and then use the electronic thereafter. And that's what, in my opinion, is the best option to select, because you're no longer worried about where your shutter speed is. You know that regardless of what you point the camera at, it will use the correct shutter speed regardless of the method. And this can save an overexposed photo. I've used cameras where this option didn't exist and ended up with an overexposed photo. The only thing to keep in mind is when you use an electronic shutter with this camera, because the readout is very slow, you will get skewing in anything that's moving quite quickly. So keep that in mind, because now and again I've had an unpleasant surprise when a taxi or a bus was kind of doing this and not particularly straight in the frame. If you plan to mostly shoot in manual exposure, you might as well ignore this part of the video. However, if you want to use aperture priority, shutter priority, or even full auto, this will save your ass, because in many cases, we've all been there. You go out, you take photos, especially in low light, you come back and there's a bit of motion blur. You don't understand why, because you put the camera in auto, so in theory it should do everything. However, unfortunately, it's not how it works. And this is where the auto ISO can help, will actually help. Auto ISO is effectively a set of settings where you tell the camera how you want the ISO and the shutter speed to behave. On the Q3, there's only two options. You can select the maximum ISO and the minimum shutter speed. The maximum ISO I've set to 12,500. Now, I know it's a high number. However, with modern editing software, it's very easy to clean that up. I would much rather deal with a little bit of extra noise in the image than have to force the shutter speed so low as to introduce motion blur. As for the shutter speed, there are three minimums that I personally select. The first one is 1/250. This is general daytime photography like it is out there right now, and I will use that most of the time. If I need to shoot in low light and I specifically want to use aperture priority, I will change it to 1/125. And if I want to ensure everything is pin sharp yet still shoot in aperture priority, I will change it to 1/500. In my experience, bouncing between these three settings has covered all of my needs. My main photography mode is aperture priority. It's the one that I use most of the time for the simple reason that I want to control the depth of field, but also because it's the easiest way, especially in the Q3 with your aperture ring, to control how much light is coming in. I will typically start at f4 because, in my opinion, it's a very nice balance between in focus, out of focus, plus you have a bit of control either way on the aperture dial in terms of how much light to let in versus block out. You're shooting at f4, you walk into a darker scene, you can quickly open it up to f2 and get some more light. Equally, you're shooting at f4, you walk out, it's proper bright out there, you can close it to f8 without a problem. Now, f2 I will use anytime I want the softest possible image, or of course the most kind of background blur, let's just say that, and low light of course. And f8 to f11 I will typically use if I want as much of the scene in focus, or there's a lot of light coming in, I don't have an ND filter, and I need to try and control it somehow. Typically between f2 to f8 is where I spend 99% of the time. f11 for extreme scenarios where there's so much light, f16 I usually don't touch. Now let's talk about shutter speed priority. This is the mode I will typically use when I need a specific shutter speed for an effect such as a shutter drag or a motion blur. I'll usually use 1/30th as a starting point, or 1/15th if I need even slower. When you go below that, you can start to kind of lose a bit of context, but that's a separate video. So 1/30th for shutter drag. The other time I will use shutter speed priority is if I am exclusively shooting at night and the ambient light will not change. The reason I use it at night is because the aperture will already be wide open, so there's nothing to control there. And I'd rather bounce between specific shutter speeds because that gives me more control. If I'm taking a still photo, I can go down as low as 1/60th. because I know I am still. Whereas if I'm moving around, I might increase it to 1/250 because I want to ensure nothing is blurry. So shutter speed priority is actually really useful for those scenarios. Now that we've selected the photography mode, the next thing is to look at exposure compensation. Now, these are not rules, this is just what works for me, and for you it might be different. Again, don't think of this as this has to be like that. Experiment with your shooting style, it might be different. So, on a normal sunny day, I will just use 0 exposure compensation, and sometimes plus or minus 0.3 depending on the overall light. If it's cloudy or foggy, I will overexpose by up to 0.6 because usually on those days the camera will naturally underexpose. If I'm shooting at night, I will actually underexpose by -1, and that's because almost every digital camera will overexpose a nighttime photo, and as a matter of fact, it's very easy to blow out highlights when shooting at night. With all of that said, don't go too crazy and try to dial in the exact exposure compensation because the RAW files are very good. If you're shooting JPEGs, it's a different story, but with a RAW file, there's no real difference between plus or minus 0.3. Sure, specific small areas of the image might be blown out, but for the most part, it's not something that I would lose sleep over. So look at it as a mere guideline to experiment with, and not a hard rule. With the compensation set, now let's look at exposure metering. This is where you basically tell the camera how you want it to meter the scene. I typically only use 2 modes. The first one is multi, which looks at the entire scene and gives you a balanced exposure for the sky, for the highlights, for the shadows, for everything. The other mode is highlight metering, where the camera will protect the highlights and you will get an underexposed photo. If you're shooting JPEGs and you want to get that harsh shadow and highlight look in camera, the highlight metering mode is good. With that said, overall, I found that the multi-metering mode is more than good enough for pretty much 90% of scenarios. And finally, we're onto the autofocus system. I will not cover every single option here. I will only talk about the ones that I use pretty much all the time. The first thing we need to talk about is AFS versus AFC versus IAF. So AFS is autofocus single, half press the shutter button, it acquires focus and then it's locked. If you move it around, if things move around, nothing will change. This is great for still life, for landscapes, for anything that doesn't move. Even if there's something moving super slowly in the distance, that should be all right for that. AFC, on the other hand, will constantly adjust the focus depending on where the subject is. If it gets closer to the lens, further away. In my experience, I would say keep the two very kind of strictly apart with regards to how you use them. So I wouldn't use AFC on still life subjects because it's looking for motion that's not there. And I've had it before that if I use AFC on something that just doesn't move, there is a small chance the focus might be slightly out because the camera will take the shot as it's hunting a little bit and trying to find that movement that isn't there. You do have the IAF feature, which is the intelligent mode that's meant to kind of switch between the two automatically. I have not had much luck with that. I would rather just control it myself because I know exactly when I will need tracking and when I don't. Moving into the autofocus modes, there are 3 primary ones that I use. The first one is spot, which is a small crosshair that you can move around the screen. It's very precise. It's actually the most precise way you can focus on the Q3. However, it can take a little bit longer and there is a higher chance of missed focus if it's not exactly where you need it to be. I use the spot for precision, so still life, product, landscape, that kind of stuff. The next is zone, which is a collection of these spots, and it covers a larger area of the screen. So wherever that area is where the camera will look for focus. However, the specific spot the camera selects will be up to the camera. That's a good mode if precision is not required and if it's very much a run and gun style approach. So if you're running for a busy market, I would use the zone in conjunction with AFC, and then okay, you might slightly miss focus exactly, but I'd rather have a good shot that's 95% in focus than have a miss shot that's 100%. The other option is field, and that's just a small square. In my opinion, it's a nice kind of halfway house between spot and zone, and it's actually the one that I use most of the time for general walkabout photography. In terms of AFS and AFC, most of the time I am in AFS because how I use the Q3 is for a more slower and deliberate photography approach, let's just say that, whereas the Sony, which is in front of me, is kind of more of the spray and pray approach. So for me, a field, focus mode and AFS has worked well, but from time to time I do use AFC and zone and still get pretty good results with it. Alright, and that's really all there is to it. The Q3 is a very simple camera, and the settings I've shared in this video will be enough to get you going and at least get you using the camera. If you want to learn more, as I've said, the full guide is linked down below, so you can support me if you wish. Otherwise, keep an eye on the blog because I will be publishing more specific articles about the Q3, going into the settings, comparing it to other cameras, going into specific setups as well in the future. So yeah, keep an eye on that. Yeah, that's it. As always, thank you so much for watching my videos. If you have any comments, questions, leave them down below. I try my best to reply to all comments and questions, but it gets to the point where it's just simply too much. So if I didn't reply to you, I apologize. I do try my best, so hopefully I'll get round to it at some point. Anyway, I'm waffling. Thank you again, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.